The air in the penthouse apartment of Marcus Davenport was a carefully curated silence, a manufactured tranquility that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. It was the sound of money so old and so vast, it no longer needed to shout. It whispered from the polished Italian marble floors that reflected the gray Manhattan sky like a still, cold lake. It hummed from the state-of-the-art air filtration system, which scrubbed the city's grime away, leaving behind an odorless, sterile atmosphere that smelled only of emptiness. Elena Rivera moved through this silence like a ghost, her presence marked only by the faintest whisper of her soft-soled shoes against the stone. Her uniform, a simple but impeccably tailored gray dress, was designed for invisibility, to blend into the muted palette of steel, glass, and shadow that constituted the home. She was a master of her craft, her movements economical and precise, leaving behind no trace but for a perfectly plumped cushion or a dust-free surface that gleamed under the recessed gallery lighting. From these heights, 60 floors above Central Park, the city was a silent, sprawling tapestry, a world away from the one she inhabited within these glass walls. She was a silent observer, a custodian of a golden sanctuary that felt more like a beautiful, sterile cage. Her duties were many, but her purpose, the one true anchor in her day, was Leo. He was a small boy of 6, with his father's serious eyes and a quiet disposition that seemed too heavy for his slender frame. He existed in this vast space like a single, precious piece of art, admired from a distance but rarely touched with genuine, unhurried warmth. His world was one of schedules, tutors, and specialists, each one promising to mold him into a worthy heir to the Davenport empire. Elena saw something else in his watchful gaze. She saw a loneliness that mirrored her own. Their interactions were small, stolen moments in the grand, empty expanse of the day. A shared glance as she replaced the orchids in the foyer, a small, almost imperceptible smile when she brought him a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice, served not in the heavy crystal tumbler his nanny insisted upon, but in a simple glass that was easier for his small hands to hold. In these fleeting connections, the sterile air of the penthouse would thin, just for a second, allowing a breath of something real, something human, to enter the space. He was the only flicker of life in the gilded mausoleum, and she felt an instinct to protect that flicker with a fierceness that startled even herself. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, in the sun-drenched library where thousands of books stood in pristine, unread rows, that they practiced their secret. To any observer, it would have looked like a silly, childish game. It began with a gentle tap of her index finger against his palm, followed by a slow curl of their fingers together, a soft squeeze, and then a final, quick flick of the thumb. It was their handshake, a silent ritual they had developed over weeks. But for Elena, it was a resurrection of a language born from love and loss, a kinetic alphabet of the heart. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The handshake was not a game, it was a ghost. It was the language she had painstakingly invented years ago for her younger brother, Matteo, a beautiful, bright-eyed boy who had been born into a world of silence, unable to speak a single word. Each gesture had a meaning, a nuance that only she and he had ever understood. The tap meant, "Are you okay?" The squeeze meant, "I am here." The final flick of the thumb was his unique signature, his way of saying, "And I am brave." The memory of Matteo was a constant low hum beneath the surface of her professional calm. He was the reason she was here, scrubbing floors in a palace of glass instead of completing her doctorate in linguistics at Columbia. Her academic career, once a thing of blazing promise, had been extinguished overnight. It had been snuffed out by the catastrophic failure of an experimental medical device from a company called Maid, a device that had promised to give Matteo a voice, but had instead stolen his breath forever. The ensuing legal battle was a brutal lesson in the architecture of power. Maid, with its army of lawyers and bottomless resources, had systematically crushed the families of its victims, burying them under mountains of legal fees and character assassinations until they were left with nothing but bankruptcy and broken hearts. The crushing weight of that debt was what drove Elena now. Every polished surface, every laundered sheet, was a payment on a debt that could never truly be settled. She worked to keep her aging parents afloat, to honor the memory of the brother she couldn't save. This job was not a surrender, it was a silent, daily act of devotion, a penance paid in a place where no one knew her name, or the searing fire of injustice that burned within her soul. The arrival of Ms. Evelyn Reed was always announced by the private elevator, which chimed with a soft melodic tone that sounded to Elena like a warning bell. Evelyn was the new nanny, a celebrated child development specialist whose reputation preceded her like a tidal wave of influence and authority. She moved with an unnerving smoothness, her tailored blazer and pencil skirt a kind of armor, her posture ramrod straight. She smelled of expensive perfume and a faint, sharp antiseptic, a scent that seemed to suck the warmth out of any room she entered. Her smile was a masterpiece of cosmetic dentistry and practiced insincerity, never quite reaching the cold, calculating intelligence in her eyes. She surveyed the world as a series of problems to be managed and inferiors to be directed. To Evelyn, Elena was not a person. She was part of the infrastructure, a functioning cog in the domestic machine, as inanimate and unremarkable as a vacuum cleaner or a dishwasher. Her gaze would slide over Elena without a flicker of recognition, a dismissal so profound it was a form of violence in itself. Evelyn was the embodiment of the world that had crushed Elena's family, polished, powerful, and utterly devoid of empathy. The confrontation, when it came, was as swift and cold as an execution. Evelyn had entered the library, her presence immediately casting a long, chilling shadow over the warm afternoon light. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, unseen, her arms crossed, a look of profound irritation tightening the corners of her perfectly painted lips. She watched as Leo, sitting on the floor, looked up at Elena and initiated the handshake. He tapped her palm, and she responded in kind, their hands meeting in the silent, familiar ritual. It was a moment of pure, innocent connection, a tiny island of safety in the vast, lonely ocean of the boy's life. But Evelyn did not see connection. She saw contamination. She saw her meticulously crafted developmental curriculum being undermined by the infantile behavior of the hired help. She saw her authority being challenged by a game she did not invent and could not control. To her, this silent language was not a bridge. It was a breach of protocol, an unacceptable deviation from the structured, joyless path she had laid out for the boy's future. The air grew thick with her disapproval, a storm gathering in the pristine silence of the room. Just then, Marcus Davenport walked in, his mind clearly on a conference call he had just finished. He was a man who understood balance sheets and market projections far better than the subtle emotional currents of his own home. Evelyn saw her opportunity. She straightened up, her expression shifting from private annoyance to one of grave professional concern. "Mr. Davenport," she began, her voice a smooth, modulated tool of manipulation, "I need to address a serious issue regarding Leo's developmental environment." She gestured towards Elena, who had frozen in place, her hand still loosely holding the boy's. "I've noticed your housekeeper engaging in these silly little games with him. While I'm sure her intentions are benign, this type of unstructured infantile interaction directly undermines the cognitive and behavioral frameworks we are trying to establish. It fosters dependency and regressive tendencies." Her words were a cascade of corporate jargon and psychological babble, each one a carefully chosen stone designed to build a wall between Elena and the child. She framed a moment of affection as a threat, a gesture of love as an act of sabotage. As Evelyn spoke, the world seemed to narrow for Elena until it was only the sound of that condescending voice and the roaring in her own ears. Each word was a fresh stab into an old wound. Infantile. The word struck her with the force of a physical blow, conjuring the image of Matteo, forever a child, his potential stolen by corporate negligence. Unstructured. The word mocked the beautiful, intricate language she had woven from pure love, a language more profound than any textbook Evelyn had ever read. A cold fury, clean and hard as diamond, began to solidify in Elena's veins. Her heart, which had been hammering against her ribs, slowed to a steady, deliberate beat. Her hands, which had started to tremble, became perfectly still. She could feel the ghost of her brother standing beside her, his small, warm hand in hers. The humiliation was immense, a hot wave of shame that threatened to drown her. But beneath it, something else was taking shape. The grief she had carried for years, a passive, heavy burden, was beginning to crystallize into something sharp, something focused. It was the birth of a resolve she didn't know she possessed. Marcus, a man accustomed to outsourcing expertise, looked from the confident, credentialed specialist to the silent, uniformed housekeeper. He was uncomfortable, out of his depth. He saw a simple problem with a simple solution. Defer to the expensive expert he had hired to handle these matters. He cleared his throat, his gaze not quite meeting Elena's. "Ms. Reed is the expert here, Elena," he said, his tone attempting a gentleness that only made the dismissal sharper. "Perhaps it's best if you stick to your designated duties from now on. We need to ensure there's a consistent approach." The words, meant to de-escalate, landed like a judge's sentence. They validated Evelyn's cruelty and rendered Elena's bond with the boy illegitimate. Evelyn offered a small, triumphant smile, the picture of professional vindication. The incident was over. Marcus and Evelyn moved on to discuss Leo's weekly progress report, their voices fading as they walked down the hall. Elena remained rooted to the spot, the echo of their judgment hanging in the opulent silence. She looked at Leo, whose face was a mask of confusion and fear. In that moment, the invisible housekeeper, the grieving sister, the forgotten victim, made a silent vow. She would not remain a ghost in this house forever. A line had been crossed, and the quietest voice in this gilded cage was preparing to find its roar. A few days later, the rhythm of the penthouse was shattered by an anomaly, a break in the meticulously scheduled universe of Marcus Davenport. He came home early. The private elevator chimed its soft, intrusive tone, not at the customary 7 in the evening, but at 3 in the afternoon, a time when the apartment was supposed to be a quiet, humming machine of domestic order, his absence its central gear. He stepped out, shrugging off his suit jacket, the weight of a collapsed billion-dollar merger pressing down on his shoulders. The deal had imploded in a spectacular fashion, a cascade of betrayals and miscalculations, and he had fled the sterile confines of his boardroom, seeking the one place he thought was still under his control. He expected silence, the familiar, expensive emptiness that usually greeted him. He moved through the foyer, his mind a maelstrom of numbers and legal clauses, the phantom voices of his lawyers still echoing in his ears. He was a man adrift in his own life, a king in a castle of glass, who felt increasingly like a prisoner within its walls, and he craved the simple, uncomplicated peace of solitude before the next battle began. He was about to call out, to announce his premature arrival, but a sound, or rather the lack of one, stopped him. From the main living area, he could hear the faint, almost imperceptible rustle of movement, but no voices. No television, no tutor, no nanny. A deep, instinctual stillness settled over him as he paused behind a large marble partition that separated the grand entryway from the living space. He peered around the edge, his eyes adjusting to the bright afternoon sun flooding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. There, in the center of a vast Persian rug that looked like a map of a forgotten kingdom, sat his son, Leo. The boy was alone, playing with a set of simple wooden blocks, his small form a stark contrast to the cavernous, opulent room around him. A pang of something unfamiliar, a sharp, bittersweet ache, tightened in Marcus's chest. He so rarely saw his son like this, unguarded, existing outside the rigid framework of scheduled excellence. He was just a boy, small and quiet, building a lopsided tower in a patch of sunlight, And for a fleeting moment, Marcus felt the immense, crushing weight of his own paternal distance. Just as he was about to step forward, to break the spell of the quiet afternoon, Evelyn Reed entered the room from the adjoining hallway. Her movements were silent, predatory. She did not see Marcus, hidden as he was by the marble column. The moment she believed herself to be alone with the child, the mask of professional warmth she wore like a second skin dissolved, evaporating in an instant. The carefully constructed smile vanished, replaced by a thin, hard line. The gentle, encouraging posture she adopted in Marcus's presence slackened into one of impatient authority. Her eyes, which normally feigned a soft concern, turned cold and flat, like chips of polished granite. The transformation was so total, so instantaneous, that it sent a jolt of unease through Marcus. It was like watching a stranger emerge from the skin of someone he thought he knew. She stood over Leo, her shadow engulfing him, and the warm, sunlit room suddenly felt several degrees colder, the air charged with an unspoken and unpleasant tension that he could feel even from his hiding place. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the melodic, patient tone she used for official progress reports. It was a low, chilling whisper laced with a venom that made the hairs on Marcus's arms stand on end. "Are you still playing with those baby toys, Leo? I thought we discussed this. We have cognitive exercises to complete. Do you want to grow up to be a disappointment?" Her words were precise, each one a perfectly sharpened dart aimed at the boy's fragile confidence. Disappointment. The word hung in the air, ugly and heavy. Marcus watched, paralyzed, as his son flinched, his small shoulders hunching inward as if to shield himself from the verbal blows. He didn't look up at her. He simply stared at his wooden blocks, his hands frozen in place. Evelyn let out a sigh of theatrical exasperation, a sound of pure contempt. "Look at me when I am speaking to you," she commanded, her voice dropping even lower, gaining an edge of menace that was unmistakable. The boy remained motionless, his silence a small, desperate act of defiance in a world where he had no power. It was then that something extraordinary happened. Leo, still staring at the floor, became aware of a subtle shift in the room's reflection. In the polished surface of a glass-encased art piece across the room, a distorted figure came into view, a man standing motionless behind a marble pillar. His eyes, wide with a dawning horror, met his son's in the warped reflection. It was his father. A flicker of something, hope, terror, a desperate plea, crossed the child's face. His gaze locked with his father's reflected image, a silent, frantic communication passing between them across the vast, silent room. Then, slowly, with a deliberation that seemed to take all the courage in his small body, Leo lifted his right hand. He did not look at Evelyn. He kept his eyes fixed on the reflection, on the silent witness to his private torment. His small fingers began to move, performing the sequence of gestures he had practiced so many times in secret, the language he shared with the only person in this house who had ever offered him unconditional kindness. He began the handshake, not the simple version, the one that meant hello or I am here. This was different. His index finger tapped his own palm not once, but 3 times, rapidly, a frantic, urgent signal. Then, instead of a gentle squeeze, his fingers clenched into a tight, white-knuckled fist, a gesture of confinement, of being trapped. Finally, instead of the quick, confident flick of the thumb that meant I am brave, his thumb trembled and tucked itself inward, hiding behind his fingers in a universal sign of fear and submission. Marcus watched, frozen in place, the world narrowing to that one small, desperate hand. The silly game. The infantile interaction. Evelyn's condescending words from the other day echoed in his mind. But now they sounded different, sinister. They were not an expert's assessment. They were the calculated lies of a predator, designed to isolate her prey, to sever the boy's only lifeline. The handshake was not a game. It was a message in a bottle, a flare sent up from a sinking ship. It was a silent, desperate scream for help. A tidal wave of ice-cold realization crashed over Marcus. Every dismissive glance he had given Elena, every time he had deferred to Evelyn's polished credentials over his own gut instinct, replayed in his mind, each memory a fresh indictment of his own willful blindness. He had bought into the performance, prioritizing the appearance of perfect parenting over the reality of his son's well-being. He had mistaken credentials for character, jargon for truth. The horror of what he was seeing was compounded by the searing shame of his own complicity. He had stood by and allowed this woman to belittle the one person who had truly connected with his son, and in doing so, he had unknowingly endorsed the very cruelty she was inflicting. The air in his lungs turned to poison. The blood in his veins felt like slush. He was no longer a billionaire master of the universe. He was just a father who had profoundly, catastrophically failed to protect his own child. The foundation of his world, built on control and authority, crumbled into dust in that single silent moment. He stepped out from behind the pillar. The sound of his leather shoe on the marble floor was a sharp, explosive crack in the tense silence. Evelyn spun around, her face a mask of pure shock, the color draining from her cheeks. Her composure fractured, and for a split second, he saw the raw, unvarnished panic in her eyes before the professional mask snapped back into place. "Marcus!" she exclaimed, her voice instantly regaining its smooth, syrupy quality. "You're home early." "I was just encouraging Leo to transition from free play to his structured learning modules." Her words were a frantic scramble to repaint the scene, to re-establish the narrative of her expertise. But Marcus wasn't listening to the words. He was looking at his son, who was still frozen, his small hand still clenched in that desperate signal of fear. He walked past Evelyn, as if she were a piece of furniture, his entire focus on Leo. He knelt down, his expensive suit creasing on the floor, and gently took his son's hand, uncurling the terrified fingers with his own. "It's okay, Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "It's okay, I'm here now." He looked up, his gaze finally settling on Evelyn, and the look in his eyes was one she had never seen before. The detached, business-like calm was gone, replaced by a glacial fury that was terrifying in its stillness. He didn't need to raise his voice. The rage was a palpable force in the room, sucking the air from her lungs. He saw her for what she was, a monster hiding in plain sight, a wolf who had been guarding his lamb. The full weight of his power, a power he usually reserved for hostile takeovers and boardroom purges, was now focused entirely on her, a silent, crushing force that she was utterly unprepared for. The balance of power in the penthouse had just shifted, permanently and irrevocably. Evelyn, sensing the imminent threat, immediately went on the offensive. Her best defense was a vicious attack, a tactic honed in corporate boardrooms and hostile negotiations. "Mr. Davenport, I don't know what you think you saw, but I must insist that you listen to me as the professional you hired," she began, her voice taking on a sharp, condescending edge. "It's clear the housekeeper has been filling the boy's head with these fantasies. She has been poisoning him against me, creating a codependent, unhealthy attachment with her silly little games. She is undermining his development for her own emotional gratification. It's a classic, if pathetic, case of transference." She was trying to frame Elena, to use her psychological jargon as a shield and a sword, confident that the word of a celebrated specialist would always outweigh that of a lowly domestic worker. She gambled that Marcus would retreat to his default setting, deferring to the expert. She made a fatal miscalculation. She had underestimated the primal power of a parent's protective instinct, once finally awakened. Her accusations against Elena, meant to deflect and confuse, only served to illuminate the depths of her own manipulative cruelty. Marcus rose to his full height, his shadow now falling over her. He looked at her, and the contempt in his gaze was so profound it was almost a physical thing. "You are accusing my staff of poisoning my son's mind?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet, each word landing like a chip of ice. "You, who I just witnessed terrorizing him when you thought no one was looking? You think a degree and a fancy vocabulary give you the right to abuse a child and then lie to my face about it? You are a fraud, Ms. Reed, a sick, twisted fraud who preys on the vulnerable. He had never spoken to anyone like this in his life, but the words felt truer than any contract he had ever signed. Evelyn's face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage. Her carefully maintained facade shattered completely, revealing the venomous, arrogant creature beneath. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "You have no idea who I am. I am the most respected specialist in my field. I will not be spoken to this way by you or anyone. You will fire that housekeeper immediately, or I will walk out of that door and I will personally see to it that your name is dragged through the mud in every circle that matters in this city. I will tell everyone that you allowed your son to be manipulated by an unstable, uneducated servant." It was a threat, a desperate, last-ditch effort to reassert her dominance, to remind him of the social and reputational power she wielded. She was certain he would buckle, that he would choose his reputation over this sudden, inconvenient, paternal awakening. Marcus simply stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, a small, humorless smile touched his lips. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, pressing a single button on his contact list. "Johnson," he said, his voice calm and clear. "I need you to come up to the penthouse immediately. Ms. Reed will be leaving. Please escort her from the premises. Ensure she takes nothing with her but the personal items she arrived with. Her employment is terminated, effective immediately." He ended the call without waiting for a response. The finality in his tone was absolute. The look on Evelyn's face was a stunning portrait of defeated hubris. The shock, the fury, the utter disbelief that her power had simply evaporated. It all warred for dominance on her features. She had played her most powerful card, and it had been met with a wall of absolute, immovable force. She had lost, and she couldn't comprehend how. The head of security, a large, impassive man named Johnson, arrived within minutes, his presence filling the doorway. He looked at Marcus, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards Evelyn. She stood frozen, her face pale, with rage and humiliation. She opened her mouth to say something, another threat, another protest, but the words died in her throat. She snatched her designer handbag from a nearby console table, her movements jerky and furious. As she turned to leave, her anger made her clumsy. Her hand struck a small, sleek tablet that had been sitting on the edge of the table, sending it clattering to the marble floor. The device landed with a sharp crack, the screen lighting up from the impact. Evelyn cursed under her breath and bent to retrieve it, but not before Elena, who had been summoned by the commotion and was standing silently in the hallway, saw the screen. For a single fateful second, the illuminated display was perfectly visible. It showed a calendar notification, a reminder for a call scheduled for the following week. The title of the event was simple: Anniversary Call, Med Innovate Acquisition. The name struck Elena with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Med Innovate. It wasn't just a name, it was a ghost. It was the monster that had haunted her family's every waking moment for years. It was the architect of her brother's death, the engine of her family's financial ruin, the reason she was standing in this hallway, a silent servant in a billionaire's palace, instead of finishing her dissertation. The world around her seemed to warp and slow down, the opulent hallway melting away until there was only that name, glowing with a malevolent light from the broken screen on the floor. 1,000 fragmented memories assaulted her at once: Mateo's hopeful smile before the procedure, the sterile smell of the hospital room, the frantic beeping of the machines as the device failed, the cold dismissive tone of the company's lawyers, the sight of her father's face, broken and defeated, after they had lost everything in the lawsuit. The name Med Innovate was the nexus of all her pain, the source of a grief so profound it had reshaped the very trajectory of her life. And here it was, on the personal calendar of the woman who had just been revealed as a cruel abuser of children. It couldn't be a coincidence. The universe did not operate on coincidences of this magnitude. A horrifying, sickening suspicion began to form in the pit of her stomach, a connection so dark and monstrous it seemed impossible, and yet, in her heart, she knew with a chilling certainty that it was true. Evelyn snatched the tablet and, under the stony gaze of the security guard, was escorted out of the apartment, her furious muttering echoing down the hall until the elevator doors slid shut, sealing her away. Marcus was still kneeling with Leo, his back to Elena, murmuring soft, comforting words to the trembling boy. He hadn't seen the tablet. He didn't know the significance of the name, only she did. Elena stood motionless, her heart hammering against her ribs not with fear but with a new, terrifying clarity. This was not just about the abuse of one child in a penthouse. This was bigger. The cruelty Evelyn had shown Leo was not an isolated act. It was a symptom of a much deeper sickness, a pattern of behavior that disregarded the lives of the vulnerable for personal gain. The humiliation she had suffered in the library, the pain of her brother's memory, the quiet desperation of her current life, it all converged on this single, shocking moment of revelation. The monster in this house had a name, and it was a name Elena knew all too well. The silent war she had been fighting in her heart had just found its battlefield. The silence that followed Evelyn's forced departure was a dense, heavy thing, entirely different from the sterile quiet that usually permeated the penthouse. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and the raw, lingering chill of revealed cruelty. Marcus remained on the floor, his arms wrapped around Leo, who was now weeping softly, the delayed shock finally breaking through his terrified paralysis. Marcus murmured reassurances, but his eyes were fixed on the hallway where Elena stood, a silent, motionless figure against the cool gray marble. He saw her then, truly saw her for the first time, not as an extension of the apartment's infrastructure, but as the quiet guardian who had built a fortress of love around his son with nothing but her kindness and a secret, silent language. A wave of profound shame, hot and sharp, washed over him. He, with all his wealth and power, had hired a monster, while she, with nothing but her quiet integrity, had been the only one fighting to protect his child. The weight of his failure was a physical thing, pressing down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He knew that any apology he could offer would be a hollow, meaningless gesture in the face of her quiet heroism. He waited until Leo had cried himself to sleep, his small body finally relaxing in his father's arms. Marcus carried him to his room, tucked him into bed with a gentleness he hadn't known he possessed, and then walked back into the living room, where Elena was quietly beginning to restore order, picking up the fallen tablet, her movements as precise and controlled as ever. He stopped her with a quiet word, her name, and it felt strange on his tongue, as if he were speaking it for the first time. "Elena," he began, his voice raspy with emotion, "I don't have the words to thank you, or to apologize for my blindness." He gestured vaguely around the opulent room, a space that suddenly felt like a monument to his own negligence. "I failed him. I failed to see what was right in front of me. You didn't. You saw him, and you protected him." His gaze was direct, stripped of all its usual corporate authority, leaving only the raw vulnerability of a father terrified by what he had almost lost. He saw the name on the tablet she was holding, Med Innovate, but it meant nothing to him, just another corporate logo in a sea of them. Elena's hand tightened on the cool plastic of the device, the name on its screen burning into her vision like a brand. Her own personal tragedy, a wound she thought had been buried under years of grief and financial struggle, was now staring back at her from the shattered screen of her tormentor's tablet. The connection was too monstrous, too specific to be a coincidence. A cold, terrifying certainty settled in her soul. She looked at Marcus, at this powerful man humbled by his love for his son, and she saw not an employer, but a potential ally, a force that could be aimed at the darkness that had consumed her own family. "My brother, Matteo," she said, her voice low and steady, each word carefully chosen, unearthed from a place of deep pain. He was a victim of a faulty medical device made by that company, Innovate. We lost everything fighting them. They buried us. They buried the truth. The story spilled from her, not as a plea for pity, but as a statement of fact, a quiet, devastating indictment that hung in the air between them. Marcus listened, his face paling as the pieces began to click into place, the scope of Evelyn Reed's monstrosity expanding beyond the walls of his home into something far more sinister and far-reaching. A new kind of anger began to smolder within Marcus, an anger that was cold and methodical. It was the same controlled fury he brought to hostile takeovers, but this time it was not about profit or market share. It was about justice. The abuse of his son was not an isolated act of a single cruel individual. It was a symptom of a systemic rot, a pattern of behavior that allowed people like Evelyn to thrive, protected by layers of corporate legal armor and social influence. He looked at Elena, at the quiet, unshakable strength in her eyes, and he made a decision. His home office, a sterile sanctuary of chrome and glass overlooking the city, was transformed overnight into a war room. He brought in his most trusted team, a bulldog of a corporate lawyer named Anya Sharma, whose reputation for dismantling corporate facades was legendary, and a discreet private investigator, a former intelligence officer named David Chen, a man who could find ghosts in the digital machine. They were sworn to absolute secrecy, their formidable skills now placed entirely at Elena's disposal. She was no longer the housekeeper. She was the heart of the operation, the keeper of the truth they were all now sworn to uncover. The initial days of the investigation were a frustrating descent into a labyrinth of legal firewalls and corporate obfuscation. Innovate had been acquired by a larger pharmaceutical conglomerate years ago, and the records of the acquisition had been sealed tighter than a vault. Every digital trail David tried to follow led to a redacted document or a password-protected server with layers of encryption that would take months to crack. Anya's legal inquiries were met with a wall of polite but firm resistance from a team of lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear. They were masters of delay tactics and procedural roadblocks, sending back reams of useless, heavily blacked-out paperwork that told them nothing. It felt like punching a mountain of smoke. The system was designed to protect itself, to exhaust and bankrupt anyone who dared to question it. Elena could feel the old, familiar despair creeping in at the edges, the same sense of powerlessness that had crushed her father years ago. The world of the wealthy and powerful had its own set of rules, and one of them was that the past stayed buried if you paid enough to keep it there. Elena, however, possessed a weapon they didn't have: memory. While David searched for digital footprints and Anya battled with legal statutes, Elena closed her eyes and walked back through the haunted corridors of the past. She sifted through the painful memories of the original lawsuit, forcing herself to relive the depositions, the courtroom appearances, the faces of the company representatives. She remembered the parade of Innovate employees who had been put on the stand, all of them repeating the same carefully rehearsed lines, their expressions impassive, their testimony a solid wall of corporate loyalty. But there had been one exception, a junior engineer, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins. Elena remembered her vividly. She had been terrified, her hands trembling as she clutched a sheaf of notes, her eyes darting nervously towards the company's lead counsel every time she spoke. She had answered the questions woodenly, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes: doubt, fear, maybe even guilt. The company lawyers had quickly cut her testimony short, claiming her role was irrelevant to the device's final approval. At the time, Elena's family lawyer had dismissed it, but now, Elena knew it was a thread, a single, loose thread in an otherwise perfectly woven tapestry of lies. Finding Sarah Jenkins became their new, singular focus. It was a monumental task. She had left Innovate shortly after the trial and seemed to have vanished. She had no social media presence, no public footprint. It was as if she had intentionally erased herself. But David Chen was relentless. He cross-referenced old employee manifests with property records, utility bills, and voter registrations, chasing a ghost across a decade of digital silence. After 3 weeks of painstaking work, he found her. She was living in a small, unassuming town in rural Vermont, working as a high school science teacher under her married name. She had built a new life, a quiet life, as far away from the world of corporate tech as she could possibly get. David presented the information to the team, a single sheet of paper with an address and a photograph of a woman with kind but haunted eyes. The next step was the most delicate. They couldn't send a lawyer or an investigator. A formal approach would spook her, send her deeper into hiding. It had to be someone she could trust, someone who could speak her language, the language of a shared buried trauma. It had to be Elena. The trip to Vermont felt like a journey to another world. The cold, vertical steel of Manhattan gave way to rolling green hills and the scent of pine and damp earth. Marcus had insisted on arranging a private car, but Elena felt like an imposter stepping into the quiet, simple life she saw around her. She found Sarah in her classroom after school, cleaning chalk dust from a blackboard, the late afternoon sun slanting through the large windows. When Elena introduced herself, a flicker of recognition, followed by pure, unadulterated panic, flashed across Sarah's face. She immediately became defensive, her body language closing off, her arms crossing in front of her chest. "I can't help you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I signed papers. I can't talk about it. Please, you have to leave." The fear in her eyes was a raw, living thing, the ghost of a threat made long ago that still held her captive. Elena saw not an obstacle, but a reflection of her own family's terror, and her heart went out to the woman. Elena did not press her. She did not mention lawyers or evidence. Instead, she spoke of Matteo. She described his laugh, the way he would watch the world with an intense, silent curiosity. She talked about the hope her family had placed in MedInnovate's device, the crushing, world-ending moment when that hope had turned to ash. She didn't accuse, she simply shared her grief, laying it bare in the quiet, sunlit classroom. "I'm not here to cause you trouble, Sarah," Elena said, her voice soft but unwavering. "I'm here because I know you saw something. I saw it in your eyes in that courtroom 10 years ago. They silenced you, just like they silenced my family. I am not asking you to fight a corporation. I am asking you to help me give my brother a voice, the one they stole from him." She then pulled out a small, worn photograph of Matteo, a picture of a smiling, bright-eyed boy, and placed it gently on the desk between them. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of a clock ticking on the wall, each second a lifetime. Sarah stared at the photograph, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. The image of the smiling boy was a key, unlocking a decade of guilt she had kept locked away. Tears began to stream down her face, silent at first, then turning into ragged, wrenching sobs. She had been a junior engineer on the device's diagnostic software team. She had been the one who discovered the flaw, a critical error in the firmware that could cause a catastrophic power surge to the neural interface under certain, rare conditions. She had flagged it, written report after report, begging her superiors to delay the launch. Her warnings were ignored, then actively suppressed. She was told she was being hysterical, that her data was inconclusive, that she didn't understand the big picture. Her final, most urgent report was submitted directly to the head of the division, the executive in charge of pushing the product through regulatory approval, the woman who had personally looked her in the eye and told her that if she ever spoke of it again, she would be personally and professionally destroyed. That woman, Sarah whispered, her voice choked with tears, was Evelyn Reed. The confirmation of her deepest suspicions did not bring Elena satisfaction, only a profound, soul-deep coldness. It was the chilling finality of knowing the monster had a face she had already seen, a voice she had already heard. Sarah, emboldened by Elena's courage and freed by her own confession, went to a locked filing cabinet in the back of the classroom. From a false bottom in the lowest drawer, she pulled out a slim, encrypted flash drive. "I copied everything," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "The internal emails, the memos, my original safety report that they ordered me to delete, it's all there." She had kept it all these years, a talisman of her guilt and a desperate, secret hope that one day the truth might matter. She handed the drive to Elena, an act of trust that was a decade in the making. As Elena's fingers closed around the small, cool piece of plastic, she knew she was holding it. Not just evidence, but a reckoning. The irrefutable proof. The voice of her brother, silent for so long, was finally about to be heard. Back in the war room, David Chen decrypted the drive. The files that bloomed across the massive screen were more damning than they could have ever imagined. There it was, in black and white, a chain of emails from Evelyn Reed, explicitly ordering the suppression of Sarah's safety report. One email, in particular, made the blood run cold. In it, she dismissed the reported flaw as a one-in-a-million statistical anomaly, arguing that a product recall would jeopardize the pending 9-figure acquisition of Med Innovate and, more importantly, the multi-million-dollar executive bonuses tied to the deal's success. She had written, "The potential financial upside far outweighs the negligible risk to a handful of patients. Negligible risk, handful of patients." The words were a monument to a soulless corporate calculus that had weighed her brother's life against a bonus and found it wanting. Elena felt a fury so pure and so focused it was almost serene. The grief that had defined her for a decade had been transmuted into something else entirely. It was no longer a weight, it was a weapon. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place the next morning. Anya, using the new information as leverage, had managed to unseal some of the acquisition documents. She discovered that Evelyn Reed was scheduled to be the keynote speaker at the annual Children's Health Philanthropic Gala, one of the most prestigious charity events in the country. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The woman who had knowingly sent a fatal device to market, who had psychologically tortured a small child in her care, was about to be celebrated as a champion for children's welfare. The stage was set, not by them, but by Evelyn's own towering arrogance. The location, the audience, the media presence. It was the perfect arena for the truth to be revealed. A plan began to form, audacious and terrifying, but righteous. Marcus would use his considerable influence and his seat on the gala's board to make a last-minute change to the program, adding a special testimonial from a parent whose child had benefited from the industry's innovations. That parent would be Elena. She would not go on stage as a housekeeper or a victim. She would go as Mateo's sister, armed with the truth that Evelyn had tried to bury forever. The team worked feverishly, preparing a presentation that was simple, elegant, and devastating. It would not be a corporate takedown. It would be a story. The story of a boy who couldn't speak, and the language of love his sister created for him. The story of a corporation that valued profit over life, and the executive who made the fatal choice. And it would all culminate with the presentation of Evelyn's own words, projected onto a giant screen for the entire world to see. As Elena rehearsed her speech, her voice did not tremble. It was calm, measured, and imbued with the unshakable weight of truth. The final confrontation was no longer a matter of if, but when. The quietest voice in the gilded cage was now ready to roar, not with anger, but with a clarity that would shatter the silence forever. The hunt was over. The execution was about to begin. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a universe unto itself, a breathtaking galaxy of shimmering crystal and old money. The air was thick, with the scent of 1,000 hothouse flowers and the cloying sweetness of expensive champagne, a fragrant fog that could not quite mask the underlying odor of relentless ambition. Light from chandeliers, each one a constellation of frozen fire, splintered across a sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos, illuminating the practiced smiles and predatory eyes of New York's philanthropic elite. On the stage, bathed in a soft, adoring spotlight, stood Evelyn Reed. She was the picture of benevolent power, her voice a smooth, modulated instrument of persuasion as she spoke of corporate responsibility and the sacred duty to protect the world's children. The applause that followed her speech was a deafening wave of validation, a testament to her perfectly crafted illusion. She stood there, accepting the adulation, a wolf in the finest sheep's clothing, utterly convinced of her own invincibility, unaware that her entire world was balanced on the precipice of a silent, long-overdue reckoning. The audience saw a savior. They had no idea they were about to witness an execution, carried out not with a weapon, but with a story. From the wings of the stage, Elena Rivera watched, her heart a calm, steady drum in the center of the storm. She wore a simple, elegant dark blue dress, a stark contrast to the glittering peacocks in the audience, and in her hand, she held a single small note card, though she didn't need it. The words were etched onto her soul. Marcus Davenport had been true to his word, his influence, a silent, unstoppable force that had parted the waters of the evening's program, creating this one. Small opening. He sat at a table near the front, his face a stoic mask, but his eyes, when they met hers for a brief second, were filled with a quiet, unwavering support. Elena took a deep, centering breath, the sterile air of the backstage filling her lungs. She felt the ghost of Mateo's hand in hers, a warm, familiar pressure that anchored her to her purpose. This was not for her. It was not for revenge. It was for him. It was for every child whose voice had been stolen, whose life had been weighed on the scales of profit and loss, and been found wanting. As the master of ceremonies announced a special, unscheduled testimonial, Elena stepped out of the shadows and into the light, her movements deliberate, her presence radiating a quiet authority that immediately began to hush the room. Her voice, when she began to speak into the microphone, was not loud, but it possessed a clarity that cut through the residual chatter of the ballroom, drawing every eye toward her. She did not introduce herself by name. She did not mention her profession. She began with a memory. "I want to tell you about my brother, Mateo," she said, her tone conversational, yet imbued with a profound gravity that commanded attention. He was born into a world of silence. He couldn't speak, but he communicated more with his eyes, with the tilt of his head, than most people do with 1,000 words. He saw the world as a place of wonder. He loved the feel of sunlight on his skin and the taste of strawberries. He was not a statistic. He was not a negligible risk. He was the center of our universe. She paused, letting the words settle into the opulent silence. She described the language they had built together, the secret alphabet of their hands, a language of love and trust. As she spoke, the gilded ballroom seemed to fade away, replaced by the image of two children in a sunlit room, their hands moving in a silent, perfect symphony of understanding. The audience was captivated, drawn into the simple, heartbreaking beauty of her story. Then, the narrative began to turn. The tone of her voice shifted, losing its warmth, taking on the cold, hard edge of irrefutable fact. "Our family was given a promise," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room before landing, with surgical precision, on Evelyn Reed, who was still standing near the podium, her smile beginning to look strained, a brittle thing. "We were promised a miracle by a company called Maid, a device that would give my brother a voice. But the company knew. They knew the device was flawed. They had reports, internal memos, warnings from their own engineers that the device could be fatal. But a lucrative corporate acquisition was on the horizon. Multi-million-dollar bonuses were at stake. And so, a choice was made. A choice to bury the truth. A choice to rush a dangerous product to market. A choice that valued a balance sheet more than a boy's life." A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a current of unease. Evelyn's face had gone rigid, the color beginning to drain from her cheeks as a dawning, horrifying recognition flickered in her eyes. She knew who this woman was now. "And in this room tonight," Elena said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow louder than a shout, "is the executive who made that choice. The woman who personally suppressed the safety reports. The woman who wrote, in her own words, that the financial upside of the deal far outweighed what she called the negligible risk to a handful of patients. As she spoke the final words, the massive screen behind the stage, which moments before had displayed the gala's logo, flickered to life. It was no longer a logo. It was a scanned document, an internal Med Innovate email, blown up to a size that was impossible to ignore. There, highlighted in a stark, accusatory yellow, was the damning sentence. And at the bottom of the email, a digital signature, crisp and clear for every person in the room to see. Evelyn Reed. A collective gasp, sharp and unified, sucked the air from the ballroom. The flash of a dozen cameras went off at once, their light catching the look of pure, unadulterated horror on Evelyn's face. Her carefully constructed world had not just cracked, it had been vaporized in a single, silent, devastating moment of truth. The silence that followed was a living entity, a thick, suffocating blanket of shock and revulsion. Evelyn stood frozen, a statue of hubris, her face a grotesque mask of disbelief. The adoring applause was now a phantom echo, replaced by a rising tide of whispers, each one a dagger. She opened her mouth, a desperate, sputtering denial forming on her lips, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, a friendly face, but she found only a sea of cold, judgmental stares. The people who had lauded her moments ago now looked at her as if she were a monster. Her power, built on a foundation of lies and polished credentials, had evaporated into thin air. At that moment, two figures, a man and a woman in plain business suits, detached themselves from the wall near the ballroom's main entrance and began to walk toward the stage, their movements calm, purposeful, and utterly final. They were not guests. They were detectives. Their presence, a quiet, official confirmation of the nightmare that had just unfolded. Evelyn's body began to tremble, the sheer, animal terror of being caught finally breaking through her shock. Her reign was over. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Elena finally exposed the truth. The downfall was as swift as it was total. The detectives reached the stage, their quiet authority an impassable wall. One of them spoke to Evelyn in a low voice, and the sight of her being read her rights, her hands cuffed behind her back in the full glare of the gala's spotlights, became an image seared into the city's collective memory. Her furious, incoherent protests were drowned out by the roar of the press, a feeding frenzy of cameras and shouted questions. As she was escorted from the ballroom, stripped of her dignity and her freedom, Elena remained on the stage, a silent, solitary figure of justice. She slowly lifted her hand and, for the entire room to see, performed the handshake one last time, the tap, for the question that had finally been answered, the squeeze, for the support that had finally arrived, and the final confident flick of the thumb, a silent, powerful declaration for her brother. And I was brave. Then she walked off the stage, leaving behind the shattered ruins of a liar's empire and a profound, indelible silence filled with the weight of a truth finally spoken. In the months that followed, the story of Evelyn Reed's spectacular fall from grace dominated the news cycle, a modern-day morality play about hubris and deception. The evidence Elena had revealed was irrefutable, leading not only to Evelyn's conviction on multiple counts of fraud and reckless endangerment, but also to the reopening of the class action lawsuit against the conglomerate that had acquired Med Innovate. This time, armed with the truth, the families won. It was a landmark settlement, a victory that could not bring back the children they had lost, but it offered a measure of justice and a public acknowledgement of their pain. Marcus Davenport, true to his word and driven by a deep need to atone for his own blindness, did more than just fund the legal battles. He established a new, powerful organization, a multi-million-dollar foundation with a singular, focused mission to provide legal and investigative resources for ordinary families fighting against corporate malfeasance and negligence. On the day of its public launch, standing before a crowd of journalists and supporters, he unveiled the name engraved on the glass doors of its new headquarters, the Mateo Rivera Foundation. Elena stood beside him, no longer an invisible presence in the background, but a leader at the forefront of the fight. She had accepted Marcus's offer to become the foundation's first executive director, a role that fit her as if it had been designed for her soul. Her quiet strength, her formidable intellect, and her unwavering empathy were now the guiding principles of an organization dedicated to giving a voice to the voiceless. Her new office was not a gilded cage, but a sanctuary of purpose. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the faces of the people she was now empowered to help. On her desk, next to a stack of case files, sat the small, worn photograph of a smiling, bright-eyed boy. She often found herself looking at it during the day, not with the familiar ache of grief, but with a sense of peaceful, profound connection. She had not been able to save her brother's life, but she had saved his truth. And in doing so, she had transformed her deepest pain into a beacon of hope for countless others, ensuring that the quietest voices would never be silenced again. If Elena's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.